The call came on a Thursday morning, 3 days after we buried my grandmother. I was sitting in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in Charlottetown, still wearing the same sweater I'd had on at the funeral, when my phone rang. It was my grandmother's lawyer. The first thing he said wasn't hello or I'm sorry for your loss. The first thing he said was, "Claire, did your mother and your aunt read the entire will?" I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know there was more to read. Let me go back to the beginning. My grandmother, Margaret Eleanor Holt, was 79 years old when she died. She had lived in the same house in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, for 51 years, a white clapboard Victorian on a quiet street 3 blocks from the harbor, with a wraparound porch and a garden that she tended herself until her hands stopped cooperating. She had been a high school English teacher for 32 years, and after she retired, she spent her mornings writing letters by hand to former students, and her afternoons reading on that porch with a cup of Earl Grey and whatever novel she was working through. She had outlived my grandfather by 14 years. She had never once asked anyone for anything. She was also the person who taught me everything I know about being a person worth knowing. I grew up in Moncton. My parents divorced when I was 9, and my mother moved us back to the island to be closer to family. What that meant, in practice, was that I spent a significant portion of my childhood at my grandmother's house. I would walk over after school and she would have something baking and we would sit at her kitchen table and she would ask me real questions, not how was school, but what did you actually think about today? She treated me like I had something worth saying even when I was 11 years old and had nothing worth saying at all. When I was 14 and going through a particularly difficult stretch, she gave me a journal and told me to write down the truest version of every day, even when the truest version was ugly. She said that you could not build a life you were proud of if you spent all your time editing yourself. I still have that journal. I still think about that advice almost every day. I moved back to the island after university. I had studied nursing at Dal in Halifax, and when I graduated I took a position at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Charlottetown partly because I wanted to be close to her. My mother and my aunt, my mother's older sister, Diane, had both stayed on the island their whole lives. But they were busy with their own things, and I sometimes felt like I was the only one who actually showed up. Not in a resentful way. It was simply true. I was the one who drove her to her cardiologist appointments in Summerside. I was the one who helped her sort through my grandfather's belongings when she finally felt ready, 8 years after he died. I was the one who sat with her through 2 winters when her mobility was poor and going outside was difficult. My Aunt Diane lived 20 minutes away and called on Sundays if she remembered. My mother was more present than Diane, but she had always had a complicated relationship with my grandmother. There were old wounds there that neither of them ever fully explained to me. What I observed was that my mother could be warm and attentive for stretches of time and then distant for other stretches, and my grandmother accepted this without complaint. She accepted most things without complaint. The house on Willow Street was worth, by the last assessment I was aware of, somewhere in the range of $800,000. That is not a remarkable number in Toronto or Vancouver, but on PEI it is significant. It was a large lot, a well-maintained heritage property, close to the water, with a renovated kitchen and the kind of porch that people in real estate listings describe breathlessly. Beyond the house, my grandmother had a registered retirement income fund, and some savings. Her estate, in total, was estimated at just over $1.2 million. She told me once, not in a morbid way but in the matter-of-fact way she had about everything, that she had been careful with her money because she wanted to leave something behind that meant something. She said she wanted what she left to reflect what she believed. I nodded at the time and didn't ask what she meant. I thought I understood. I found out later that I only understood part of it. She passed on a Monday evening in late October. It was the kind of evening she would have liked, cool and clear, the maple out front still holding its color. I had been there that afternoon and she had been tired but coherent, and we had talked about a novel she was reading, a Canadian one set in the prairies, and she had made a joke about the weather, and I had laughed and kissed her on the forehead when I left. She died in her sleep 4 hours later. The palliative care nurse called me at 11:15. I called my mother. I called my aunt. I drove back to the house and sat on the porch in the dark until the funeral home arrived. The days that followed were what those days always are, a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. Arrangements, phone calls, casseroles arriving at doors, the strange formality of choosing a casket. My mother and Diane took over most of the logistics, which I was grateful for. I handled the hospital notifications and the immediate paperwork because I understood that kind of bureaucracy better than they did. The funeral was on a Friday. The church was full. 32 years of students, decades of neighbors, people my grandmother had quietly helped in ways I was only learning about at the reception. A woman I had never met told me my grandmother had anonymously paid 3 months of her rent when she was a young single mother and had never mentioned it once. I stood there holding a cup of lukewarm tea, thinking about how many other stories like that were in that room. The will reading was scheduled for the following Monday, at the office of a lawyer named Robert Gallant on Queen Street. I drove my mother there. Diane met us in the parking lot. I remember thinking it felt strange to be doing this so soon, but the lawyer had explained that there were time-sensitive elements and he wanted to proceed promptly. We sat in a boardroom with a large window overlooking the street. Robert Gallant was a calm man in his 60s, unhurried, precise. He read the will steadily and without drama. My grandmother had left the house and the bulk of her estate jointly to my mother and my aunt. She left me her library, several hundred books, many of them annotated her writing desk, and a specific amount of $40,000 to be used, as she phrased it, for any purpose that brings Claire closer to the life she is building. I did not feel cheated. I want to be clear about that. The books alone were worth more to me than I can explain, and the $40,000 was more money than I had ever received at once in my life. I sat in that boardroom and felt genuinely grateful, and thought that this was exactly the kind of thing she would do, leave the practical things to her daughters and leave me something personal. My mother and Diane seemed pleased. Relieved, maybe? There was a brief conversation with the lawyer about next steps, about probate timelines, about the process for transferring the property. The meeting wrapped up in under an hour. We stood outside on the sidewalk and my aunt talked about what she and my mother might do with the house, and whether it made more sense to sell immediately or rent it for a season first. I listened. I didn't have opinions about it. It wasn't mine to have opinions about. That evening, my mother called me and told me they had decided to sell. She said the market was good and neither of them wanted the responsibility of maintaining the property, and she thought a clean break was healthier. I said that made sense. She said they were going to list it in the spring. I went to sleep that night sad but at peace. The call from Robert Gallant came 3 days later. I was in the Tim Hortons parking lot because I had stopped there on my way to a morning shift, and when I saw his name on my phone, I answered with a vague sense of confusion. He asked if I was somewhere I could talk. I said yes. He paused, and then he asked me the question that I had no frame for at all. Claire, did your mother and your aunt read the entire will? I told him I assumed they had. He had read it aloud in the boardroom. He said, I read the document I was given. Yes. But there was a sealed addendum attached to the original will, a second envelope that was meant to be opened immediately following the primary reading. It was in the file. I set it on the table during the meeting. I said I didn't remember a second envelope. He said my mother had picked it up along with several other documents and put it in her bag. He had assumed she would review it at home and contact him with questions. She had not contacted him. He had called her twice that week, and she had not returned his calls. He had then called me. I asked him what was in the addendum. He said he couldn't tell me the full contents over the phone, and he needed my mother and aunt present for the proper reading. But he could tell me that it contained conditions, specific conditions attached to the bequest of the house and the primary estate assets, and that those conditions had a 30-day compliance window that had already begun. My hands were shaking slightly when I hung up. I called my mother. She didn't answer. I texted her. I said it was important, and it was about the estate. She called me back 40 minutes later, while I was already at the hospital and had to step into a supply closet to take the call. I told her what the lawyer had said. There was a long pause. Then she said she had found an envelope in the papers, and she thought it was just a copy of something, and she hadn't gotten around to reading it yet. I asked her if she still had it. She said she thought so. I said she needed to call Robert Gallant back, and she needed to do it today. She sounded annoyed. She said she didn't understand why there would be an addendum if the will had already been read, and she didn't appreciate the lawyer going around her to call me. I said I didn't have any answers for her, but that she needed to make the call. We hung up. She called Gallant the following day. The three of us, my mother, Diane, and I went back to the boardroom on Queen Street that Friday morning, 1 week after the original reading. Robert Gallant set the envelope on the table, still sealed in front of us, and explained that my grandmother had instructed him to ensure it was opened in the presence of all beneficiaries. He had not been able to do that in the first meeting, because it had been removed before he had the opportunity. He said this with no accusation in his voice, simply as fact. He opened the envelope and read, my grandmother had written the addendum herself, in her own handwriting, and it had been witnessed and notarized 8 months before her death. Robert Gallant read it in the same steady voice he used for everything, but I could feel the air in the room changing as the words came out. The addendum stated that the bequest of the family home and the primary estate assets was conditional. The conditions were 3. The first condition was that the property at Willow Street could not be sold for a minimum of 2 years from the date of her death, and during that period, it must be maintained and kept in the family. My grandmother had written that the house had been a gathering place for 51 years, and she did not wish it to be converted immediately into a transaction. The second condition was that within the 2-year period, my mother and Diane were expected to establish and fund a small annual bursary in my grandfather's name at the local high school, a minimum contribution set at $5,000 per year, in recognition of his belief in education and the importance of supporting young people from the Seven-Atemene Island. The third condition, and this was the one that made the room go completely silent, was that Claire, meaning me, was to be given the use of the primary guest suite in the house on Willow Street for as long as I wished to remain, at no cost, for the duration of the 2-year period, and that I was to be treated as a full and welcome member of the household in any arrangements made regarding the property. My grandmother had written, and Robert Gallant read this carefully and clearly, "Claire has given more of herself to this family and to me personally than she has ever been acknowledged for. I am not correcting an injustice with this condition. I am simply asking that my daughters see what I have always seen." The addendum went on to state that if any of the 3 conditions were not met within the compliance period, the bequest of the primary estate assets would be redirected in full to a named charitable foundation, the PEI Community Foundation, to be used for their literacy and education programs. My mother and Diane would retain only their personal bequests, which were minor. The room was very quiet. Diane spoke first. She said she didn't understand how a conditional bequest worked legally and whether this was actually enforceable. Robert Gallant said it was fully enforceable, that it had been drafted carefully, and that he had advised my grandmother on exactly that question when she brought it to him. My mother was looking at the table. I couldn't read her face. I was looking at the window, at the gray October street outside, thinking about my grandmother at her kitchen table asking me what I had actually thought about that day. Thinking about the journal she gave me, thinking about how she had never once said to me, "Your mother and your aunt don't show up the way you do, not once in 30 years, and yet she had seen it, she had seen all of it, and she had found her own quiet way of saying so." I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something more complicated, a grief that had a different shape than the grief I had been carrying all week. This was the grief of being known by someone who was no longer there to know you. The practical weeks that followed were not easy. My mother called me that evening. The conversation was difficult. She said she felt blindsided, that she didn't think my grandmother would have done this, that it felt like being corrected in public. I listened. I didn't argue. At one point she said something that I think she meant less harshly than it came out. Something to the effect that she didn't know I had been positioning myself with her mother all those years. I said, quietly, that I hadn't been positioning myself. I had been showing up. Those are different things. She was quiet for a long time after that. Diane was more pragmatic about it. She called me 2 days later and said she thought the conditions were manageable, and she wanted to work out the details. She was not warm about it, but she was not hostile either. I appreciated the practicality. I moved into the guest suite at the Willow Street house in November. I want to describe what that was like because I think it matters. The room my grandmother had kept for guests was at the back of the house, overlooking the garden. It had a window seat, with a cushion she had reupholstered herself at some point in the 90s, faded to a soft blue. It smelled the way the whole house smelled: wool and wood smoke and old paper. The first night I slept there, I lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house and thinking that I was somehow still close to her, in a place she had made, surrounded by things she had chosen. I also thought about what she had actually done. She had not given me the house. She had not tried to replace what she had given to her daughters. What she had done was more careful than that. She had created a structure that required my mother and aunt to make a choice. They could honor her conditions, which meant acknowledging me, funding a bursary, and preserving the house for 2 years. Or they could choose not to, and lose everything to a foundation she trusted. She had not made the decision for them. She had set the terms and let them decide who they wanted to be. That was so entirely her that it made me cry in the dark of that back room on my second night there. The bursary was established in February. My mother and Diane both contributed. It was named the Gordon Holt Memorial Bursary, after my grandfather, and the first recipient was a 17-year-old from Suris who wanted to study environmental science. My grandmother would have liked that. I stayed in the house through the winter and into spring. I learned things about it. I had never known in all my years of visiting which floorboards creaked, which window let in a draft, where my grandmother kept her spare keys and her best stationery. I read through her library slowly. Many of the annotations in her books were single underlined sentences with a small check mark in the margin. No other notation. Just the line and the mark. I found myself reading every underlined passage carefully, trying to understand what had struck her, what she had wanted to remember. There was one passage she had underlined in a novel by Alice Munro. I won't reproduce it here, but the idea was about how certain people carry their worth very quietly, and the world only understands the size of what they held after they are no longer holding it. She had put 3 check marks beside it. My mother came to the house for the first time since the funeral in late February. She came on a Sunday, when I was making soup and the kitchen smelled like it used to. We didn't talk about the will or the addendum or any of it. She sat at the kitchen table, her mother's kitchen table, the one I had done homework at as a child, and she drank tea and we talked about ordinary things. At some point she said the house looked well. I said I was trying to take care of it. Before she left, she stopped in the hallway and looked at the photographs on the wall, decades of family pictures, several of which included me at various ages standing next to my grandmother. She looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "She loved you very much." I said I knew. She nodded and put on her coat and left. I stood in the hallway after the door closed and looked at the photographs too. There is a picture of me at about age 12, sitting on the porch steps with my grandmother. She has her arm around me and she is laughing at something I have apparently just said. I look very pleased with myself. I remember that summer vaguely. It was a difficult one at home, and I had spent a lot of time at Willow Street. I don't remember what I said that made her laugh, but I remember the feeling of being on that porch, of being somewhere that felt entirely safe, and of being with someone who thought I was worth listening to. The house is still standing. The bursary is in its 2nd year. My mother and I talk on the phone more than we used to. And every morning, before my shift, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea, and I think about what she said to me once, when I was 15 and crying about something that felt enormous and turned out not to be. You are going to be one of those people who makes things steadier for everyone around them. That is not a small thing. Don't let anyone tell you it is. The greatest thing my grandmother left me was not in any document. It was the knowledge of what it feels like to be fully seen by someone who has no reason to flatter you. Once you have felt that, you spend the rest of your life trying to offer it to others. That is the inheritance that actually lasts.